the doctrines people believed in don't have consequences, right? And so when the left comes and bullies them, those consequences are more real than anything they're believing in doctrines anyways. So it's really just sort of the crumbling away of, I think, an edifice that has just sort of been supported and unchallenged, and now you have the left throwing rocks at it, and they're realizing, oh my gosh, there's really nothing supporting any of this superstructure. I think the doctrines actually do have consequences, and I do think the doctrines ultimately pin upon reality. I think that's why they are doctrines. But for whatever reason, there's been this understanding that ultimately they really don't.
Okay, everyone. Welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. And today I am joined by Lenny Esposito and Logan Zeppieri. The topic for tonight's roundtable, which I guess we just decided about 2 minutes ago, is a trend that I think we've all been seeing, not just in the evangelical church or evangelical churches, I guess, but that's also really showing itself in the Roman Catholic Church as well, and even in the Eastern Orthodox churches. And it's kind of a move towards what we might call, or we'll try and coin this term, a post-doctrinal Christianity. And what we're talking about here is a move that we've seen made by the Vatican, for example, in its declaration by the Dicastery of Doctrine of the Faith on December 18th, the Fiducia Supplicans, where there was a development in the doctrine of priestly blessings, which was explicitly extended to people in same-sex unions. I think with a parallel to that is which was a determination that was made by the Anglican Church just a few weeks before that, which went under the name, I think it was Prayers of Love and Faith, which was also a blessing for people in same-sex unions. Of course, all the while, there's not. It's said that there's no change to the actual doctrines, but these practices are now being implemented. And I think we saw something similar last year when Andy Stanley held his Unconditional conference, which we did a podcast on, we'll link to, where there's this, again, this emphasis on the move seems to be, Lenny, an emphasis, I'll start with you, an emphasis on pastoral care and counseling to the exclusion of or separation from what we might call theological teaching or doctrinal teaching. So yes, let's explore this a little bit because it seems to be pervasive.
Right. So there's a little bit of a difference. I guess we want to nuance ourselves a little bit because there are folks. There's obviously a subset of Anglicanism who have followed mainstream denominational social theories and things of that nature, where they won't see this as a sin at all.
Yes.
So even though perhaps some of their leadership, Council of Bishops or what have you, vote in order to sustain the historic understanding of sexual morality and things like that. Really, in all aspects, the Methodists and a lot of the American Episcopalians and things of that nature are basically, it's not even a sin to them. So of course they have no problems with same-sex unions. They've got, lesbian rectors and things of this nature.
Yeah.
So, right. But within the Anglican commune specifically within the Roman Catholic Church, that's not necessarily the case. There are individuals who may disagree, but the official doctrine is that this is still a sin. The problem comes in is twofold. First is, how do we minister to individuals who we know have this orientation, have this specific prediction, or this specific kind of pattern in their life? And then secondly, not only how do we minister to them, how do we try to reach and maybe witness to them and draw them into the fold? So I think there's two aspects to it. There's a kind of a public persona of how do we treat those in society who are same-sex attracted, that kind of thing. And then secondly is, what do we do with those in our communion itself who are practicing this, who, are some, what they would say, otherwise good congregants, right? So I think those are the two poles, the public and the local. And what it seems to me is they want to have it both ways. They're separating, as you said, the idea of doctrine from the idea of public policy and pronouncements. And it's really hard to say that that you don't want to be judging of somebody when you have a doctrine that says this is wrong, because by its nature, doctrines are divisive. You fall on one side of the line or not. You either believe it or you don't. So what I'm seeing here is it's part of this encroachment of the late 20th century, early 21st century concept of feelings matter more than maybe what you would reduce doctrine to, which would be an academic position. I mean, it's nice that the theologians have worked this all out, but it's the feelings of the people that are real, and the abstract ideas of morality and theology. Those are additional aspects that are important, but not more important than the individual, because if the individual is offended, that takes precedence. And that's kind of what I see their logic as.
Well, and I mean, another way you could present, and Pope Francis uses this kind of language all the time, and it shows up. Again, we'll leave aside those denominations that have already been doing this for like 30 or 40 years, and now you might even say that, I don't know, is the Vatican or formerly conservative evangelical churches now just trying to catch up. But the language that will often be used is the difference between experience or encounter. Pope Francis will talk about encounter, personal encounter, versus sort of a doctrinal or propositional claims. Mm-hmm. Right. And there is a truth to that. I mean, the truth of Christianity is not entirely contained in just propositional statements. And even if one had an intellectual assent to all the correct theological statements, that would still not make one a Christian, right? There's got to be something like a personal relationship that goes beyond mere intellectual consent. It's got to be something related to the will, right?
Even the demons believe, right?
But what seems to be the problem in the Vatican's language and in the language of a lot of churches in the evangelical world today is this idea that the propositional claims almost have no relevancy.
Well, I think they have relevancy, but they're just not practically applied. Is the
or they're not being being practically applied.
Yeah, and again, I think it because, and there's, to be fair, when you're in the modern milieu, there is a lot of pressure on you, and there's been a lot written on this, where people don't like to be called bigots. People don't like to be pigeonholed as haters. And because of the rhetoric of the left, it happens to be a pretty big cudgel that these guys start to wield in order to, basically beat up those who would stand against that kind of an approach. The breakdown is that feelings aren't necessarily the primary aspect of what we as Christians are supposed to guard when we are instructed to love our neighbors as ourselves. And I think this is part of the modern mix-up. I mean, Jesus, when a man came up to him and said, Lord, let me bury my mother and father, then I'll follow you. He said, let the dead bury the dead. I mean, he was pretty cruel about that, right? Because although, and realize that passage, for anyone who's listening, that wasn't like their parents were both on hospice at that point in time. That's not what he meant. I still have to take care of my folks. They've got another 10 or 20 years. And then once they're gone, then I can follow you. He goes, you know what? There's not time for that. If you want to follow me, you got to get serious about it. Rich young ruler, go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, then come follow me. There are sacrifices that one must make as a follower of Christ that don't spare your feelings. And this is where the rub comes in, because morality has real world consequences. And that's the part that we're not talking about in this situation.
I'm going to read a quote here, just to put a cap on that point. And then I'll have Logan chime in on some of the rhetoric and the pressure maybe from the world that is being put on churches to sort of, in propagandistic style, to sort of force their hand a little bit. But here's a quote from 1986, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, on the issue of theology versus care and counseling. I quote, "We wish to make it clear that departure from the church's teaching or silence about it in an effort to provide pastoral care is neither caring nor pastoral. Only what is true can ultimately be pastoral. The neglect of the church's position prevents homosexual men and women from receiving the care they need and deserve," end quote. Now, that was written in 86. And of course, but he still was the predecessor of not St. Francis, Pope Francis. And I know some of our evangelical listeners might be like, why are you guys quoting Catholic popes and scholars on this one? Well, one of the things that Hans Boersma points out in his recent article in Touchstone magazine, and Boersma is an Anglican, I believe, which is titled "The Fall of Rome." In a sense, it was Catholic sexual teachings have been much more orthodox and strict and conservative over the last couple generations than Protestants, by and large, right? So it has been a sense that the Catholic Church was sort of like still the guiding light on issues related to, theology of the family, theology of the body, and human sexuality, whereas most Protestant churches had long since capitulated and given into, the now we knowism of, the medical or the social sciences or whatever. So, okay, but Logan, you're in politics. So, I mean, it does seem to me that it's just, there's a big, what is it called? Bully's pulpit out there, big ballywick or whatever, a big stick that's being wielded by the left, against churches to, pressure them into, if not capitulating completely on teachings, to practicing things in such a way that the teachings seem to become fairly marginalized in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I think the best way to take this angle. I was reading. Everyone has to read their Ayn Rand once in a while. Just a little fiery, whatever going on. Even if you agree or disagree with her, I mean, even she was like embodied her philosophy, which is just so funny. But there's a famous quote from John Galt, I think is his name. He gives a speech about over the millennia, over the ages, there's really been two positions of morality, and one argues for to make sacrifices for the ghosts in heaven, and the other is to make sacrifices for the incompetents on earth. And the thrust of that is like there's no why are you doing it? It's fake. It's all fake. You have these deontic obligations, or you have these people who really aren't worth your time anyways, and you're just bickering over which one to sacrifice to. And the reason why I say that is because I think what has happened, I think it's been going on for a long time, which is the sort of realization that, I don't know if I want to say realization, because I think that gives a connotation that I mean the reality behind the doctrines, but we'll just say a sort of realization that the doctrines people believed in don't have consequences, right? And so when the left comes and bullies them, those consequences are more real than anything they're believing in doctrines anyways. So it's really just sort of the crumbling away of, I think, an edifice that has just sort of been supported and unchallenged, and now you have the left throwing rocks at it, and they're realizing, oh my gosh, there's really nothing supporting any of this superstructure. And so then it's like, either nostalgia or like the rocks, and most people are choosing the rocks over the nostalgia because I'm losing my job if I don't go along with this. But if I go along with the other view, great, when I go home and pray at my dinner table, I can feel triumphant in some kind of way, maybe. And so I think this is this interesting place to be in, where I think the doctrines actually do have consequences, and I do think the doctrines ultimately pin upon reality. I think that's why they are doctrines. But for whatever reason, there's been this understanding that ultimately they really don't. And through that sort of assumption, we are now facing not just rhetoric. It's not just rhetoric, right? It's not just you're a bigot if you don't do it. It's like, you're a bigot and you're going to be fired, or you're going to be expelled from your church, or we're going to go to your home and call you a bad person in front of your wife and children, and then mock you until you want to kill yourself. It's those are more real than the question of homosexuality. But homosexuality has brought about AIDS and all these other things. So it's there are actually real consequences, but we're not allowed to talk about them, or we shouldn't talk about them. Well, that's very disrespectful. So it's so to respond to your point about the rhetoric, it's I don't think it's sure rhetoric in one sense, but it's, actually getting beyond the rhetoric's the easy part. I think most people can live with being called haters. I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah. So what you're saying is the doctrines that have to do, especially with metaphysical realities, perhaps there is just a mere intellectual assent to them, but then when put under pressure, people are realizing that the real world consequences of losing your job, being publicly ostracized, those outweigh their, let's just put it bluntly, their fear of, dishonoring God, but
take for example the doctrine of man and the natural kinds, right? This is a Christian view. And if you read through Abolition of Man, I'm going through a few of our students, and going through the Abolition of Man. I said, okay, but notice what Lewis is like. I'm going to be called an obscurantist because I'm going to he's just trying to stop progress. Yeah. Blah, 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 blah. And he's like, but hold on. He said, if we reduce man to material, which he thinks is the ultimate consequence of this path, he said, then the conqueror becomes the slave. right? This is just Plato. This is Plato's Republic. If you have no higher principle, you're going to be kind of thrown to the beasts of the passions, and they're going to tear you apart eventually. And I said, but we're seeing the first steps of this. I mean, Lewis is responding to eugenics of World War II and those sorts of things. Like, things like this were happening. He's like, in time, we'll get the psychological stuff off the ground, but the biological is happening now across the world. You can look at what's happening in the US, you can look at what's happening in England, you can look at what's happening in Japan, you can look at all this stuff. He's like, but when I talked to the students, I said, but it seems like this is what we're doing with the trans community. We have reduced the body, not the psychology quite yet, because we can't really carve it out. We're still unsure how to carve that out. But we've carved out the body, we've reduced it to material, and what we're seeing is like a 70% suicide rate. Like, there are consequences. And for some reason where you have somehow disconnected the consequences from the belief that your body's just material. Right? Like, but like, this would be a perfect example of like telling Christians, like, it's not just we have this really cool idea of the humankind and like, you know, the Statue of David's really cool, and so that's why we believe it. It's like, no, like, there's this idea of the humankind because we believe it's a particular object. The object has certain life and it has certain capacities. It has certain like end goals. Statue of David's pretty nice because it's supposed to exemplify some of those aesthetic beauties. But ultimately, like, when you abuse it, you end up becoming a slave and then end up killing yourself. Like, that's a problem, right? Like, you can't run a society like that. Practically speaking, Lewis makes what seems to be a very metaphysical case, but he just ties it to the basic ways in which we live. Like, if you don't have something that's overarching, then you just have slaves and tyrants. Like, that's what you have at the end of the day. And to live in a world of slave and tyrants gives you masters and, you know, direct consequences. Not just theoretical. Like I think we're still at a place that we can still agree that slavery is a real consequence.
One of the problems here is, first of all, these doctrines don't hang individually, you know, on their own. Christian doctrine is an integrated understanding of humanity, of how we're developed, what we're made for, ideas of value, that personal pleasure, autonomy, and safety are not necessarily the highest values, although that those are the values that we are exercising when we talk about these specific issues. And then thirdly, of course, you do have, I mean, I know people dismiss the slippery slope, but have we not seen it? We know the transgenderism is highly damaging. The WPATH files that just came out yesterday, where they, uncovered this organization that's basically the national promoter of transgender health issues, supposedly. They uncovered all of the doctors' conversations where they said, this is, we would never do this for any other treatment point. I mean, here's the known cancer risks that we're saying. Here's a girl that has liver cancer. We know the hormones gave it to her, but we're going to go ahead and schedule the double mastectomy anyway. Mm-hmm. Monstrous kinds of approaches, because it's still couched in this idea of we can't hurt not this girl's feelings, but the whole transgender community's feelings. We can't make them feel like they're wrong in any way, shape, or form. And it's fascinating because every parent knows that disciplining your child is a hard thing, right? If you love your child, you'd better discipline them. But nobody enjoys doing the discipline. I don't think most parents are excited about that in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes, I used to scoff when you heard a parent say, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. But a lot of times that's true. You just don't like punishing your kids, but it's a necessary thing. And we're now living in a society where nobody should ever get punished for anything. And then to have the basic authorities of the church pick up this concept and run with it in the same way, it's no wonder that it's going to erode the social moral fabric that really undergirds our society.
Yeah, but even like,
yeah, I mean, and I think that, yeah. Go ahead, Logan.
No, I was just saying, and you can keep compounding that, and that's where I think, when we have conversations about doctrines and their efficacy, and even questions, when you hear people say like, I deconstructed my beliefs, it's always couched in the terms that I've turned from the doctrines that just sort of exist to something that's more real. Or in your, I think you had referred to like the encounter over the beliefs or the propositional themes. But like the assumption is that the propositional content has no connection to reality, which is just a bizarre thing to assume. Like, where did the
Yeah.
propositional content come from the beginning if it wasn't connected to some form of reality? And so like for example, like the doctrine of sin, like, oh, I know we're all bad, we're kind of sick of that, but it actually has explanatory power. Like, you know, people are selfish, people are self-interested, they want to do these things, they will take advantage of you. It starts painting a dark picture, but it's like we readily accept this proposition for like describing the way politics is running. We're readily able to use this explanation to describe CEOs of businesses that make exorbitant amounts of money, like so on and so forth. But it's like, but what about your neighbor? Like, well, the neighbor, he's like, or the trans person. Like, could this just be like sinful desire? And it's like, well, we don't want to go that far. You're like, why not? It seems like everybody else is, except these, people you want to protect in some kind of, feel good kind of way. But the point isn't so much targeting these people. It's the point of saying that sin has an explanatory power.
If the church or churches, I mean, regardless of which tradition we're talking about, and maybe it's better in the Eastern Orthodox churches. When I was over on Theology Mom with Christie Bontrager, there has been this sense over the last decade or two, like, where can Protestants run to, because all the denominations are going liberal, and then it's, we can run to the Catholic Church because they're more traditional or whatever. Yeah, under Benedict, but now under Francis, it's a different story. And then it's like how far east can you run to get back into some kind of more traditional form of the church that is holding fast on the unpopular doctrines of, at least unpopular in Western society.
But I would even push back.
Of course,
but
you don't want to. We're not saying.
No, but even push back. Be like, but why are you pursuing these other doctrines? Like, are you going to the Catholic Church because you like the building you're going into? Like, I'm just saying, like, is it really substantive?
Well, no, and I was just talking about on these sexual issues.
Yeah.
These issues of sexual.
No, what I'm saying is, like, it might.
I mean, you would have to take in the whole thing into consideration. You're not going to. You really should not convert to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy only because you think that some churches, a lot of Protestant churches, obviously have gone liberal over the last 50 years, 60 years, especially in the area of theological anthropology. There's still that still wouldn't be sufficient cause to convert to some other tradition. I'm just saying that I know it has been one motivating factor, I think, amongst some to convert, because they at least believe that they're finding refuge or safe haven from what we just call liberal Protestantism, or progressive Christianity.
No, well, I wasn't trying to knock it.
But my point,
it wasn't to like knock necessarily. What I was trying to get is like, it seems like there's a possible way in which people are moving from one, I don't know what you want to say, one of the pillars of Christianity. I don't know how you want to, like, the different sects, or how, however you want to carve that out terminology wise, but moving from, say, Protestant to Eastern Orthodox or Protestant Roman Catholicism, and you're arguing for a refuge, like, are these individuals looking at the doctrines and saying, for nostalgic purposes, now they might not say it, they not cash it out like linguistically that way, but are they saying like, oh, I'm going to this church because they really understand how these doctrines apply? Or is this more of this sort of like, I just think they have propositionally a more coherent doctrine, and it's still the wrong move. Like, it's just, you're just saying, I don't like how the thin view of doctrine is not working out here, so I'm going to move over here because it just hasn't infected this section of the Christian world. It's still just as thin, and my justification for believing it's just as thin. That makes sense?
Well, right. Well, I'm just saying, like, yeah, but it would just back to your point though of sin, and I mean, we're getting to the, you start getting to this point of where, what if any iteration of the church is really calling out sin in such a way that one must be transformed, right? And this was one of our this was a criticism of hashtag he gets us, made by several conservative commentators. There's just nothing there. There's nothing. It's almost as if, look, the church has nothing left to do because the secular institutions are taking care of all the welfare issues. So, and we're losing, and churches are losing numbers. So you kind of do this thing of where, like, well, let's just get on board because we want the secular institutions to continue to support us. Because we want to just be, it's kind of like, it's kind of like the church becomes a branch of government, right? The church becomes sort of another mouthpiece or another branch, a wing of the secular state that sort of provides kinds of social and psychological services for the community. We still want religion in the culture. We still want religion in our society because we feel it has certain kinds of benefits for people in a very sort of imminent way. It provides certain goods. It gets people together. It gives them rituals to perform and so on and so forth. And that's healthy in a sense. And it's that sort of liberalizing movement. Of course, it's been going on for a while. It's nothing new, but now we're just seeing it, I think, more and more encroach on, in segments of the culture, especially in light of the uptick in LGBTQ plus, in the LGBTQ plus political movement, right? So that now there is no gospel of transformation. There's no gospel of that includes, a real reconciling for sin that might come if one is not repentant. And in that really sense, there's no real, as you said, there's no real transcendent hope then either. We are just in a place where it's get what you can now, get it while it's hot, get it while it's fast. And even if there are real world consequences for that, health benefits or health, concerns that arise, well, bite the bullet on that one.
Yeah. So a couple of things, you talk about transformation, and I think that's an important point because Christianity has always been a faith that is at its root transformative, that moves people out of their sin nature and into a new nature. That's the project of Christianity while we're here on earth. And Rosaria Butterfield makes a really good point in this, where she talks about how the Andy Stanleys of the world and folks like that who say, well, you may claim to be a gay Christian, where you have an orientation towards an individual, and that's okay. Maybe as long as you're celibate, but that's okay. But then you're setting yourself up for this internal conflict. The problem is there's no concept of mortification of sin, which was a really important aspect, especially within the early church. The idea that you die to the sins that you had, and you have to continually put those sins to death, because if you allow them space, then they will fester and grow. And it makes it a lot harder, right? So you can't be an alcoholic and still have, just one wine after dinner, right? That's because that makes it so much harder to conquer alcoholism. And similarly, and this is the primary way I say Stanley got it wrong, because if you listen to his talks and how he even explained it after the controversy broke, he said, you have these individuals where their primary identity, is this same-sex attraction, and how can I shun them away? And my response is, that's not supposed to be their primary identity. That's the point. The point is they're supposed to identify as Christians primarily. What does that entail? That entails mortifying these sins, whether it be greed, whether it be lust in terms of heterosexual lust or homosexual lust or what have you. Whatever your penchant is, you are to die to that aspect. And Paul spends an awful lot of ink in Romans talking about the old man and dying to the flesh and things of this nature. And we live this. I mean, when was the last time you heard a sermon by a pastor on the mortification of sin and the mortification of the flesh? It just doesn't happen in our evangelical churches today, let alone Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And if we miss that, we're losing a central tool in our arsenal as people who will shape the kingdom of God.
Yeah, I mean, you referenced earlier Christian Smith's term, moral therapeutic deism. I mean,
Right.
When he coined that term, I mean, he really captured something. I mean, that term's been used now for well over 10 years to kind of, capture the mood of the culture, but it is pretty accurate. I mean, the problem is, I guess when we do reduce Christianity down to that, it's not very therapeutic at the end of the day.
No. Yeah.
It really doesn't help. And then that's where, then going back to all the damage that results. And I tell you what, in this was really one of the editors. And so Hans Boersma wrote the article. We'll link to this, The Fall of Rome. And then one of the editors, Bill Tye, responded. I think this was an incredible insight by Bill Tye, who I've met. And I don't know if he's Catholic or Protestant, but he was talking about Chris Christie, who Bill Tye assumed Chris Christie was fairly liberal with regards to same-sex marriage. But I guess Christie really wrestled with the idea of same-sex marriage because he grew up in a Roman Catholic home on the East Coast, right? Where also more kind of traditional, rough and tough guy, where, it was homosexuality was wrong, right? And same-sex marriage was not right. It was disordered. But now, but Christie's not some Bible, like deeply, rooted in the Word of God type Catholic. It's more cultural for him. But where Christie now is on record saying, well, now that Pope Francis has kind of made the declaration in Fiducia Supplicans and signed off at, I guess the tension for me is gone. I can now embrace same-sex marriage as okay.
Yeah.
And Bill Tye relates this to basically what Jesus says, woe to you who, when he has the children in front of him.
Yeah, stumble the children, absolutely.
Who cause these little ones to stumble. Because even though Christie's a big guy physically, he's kind of like a little one in the faith, right? You sort of, and now he thinks, he's convinced it's okay because Fiducia Supplicans came out and the Vatican thinks it's okay to bless these people. And even though the official teaching hasn't changed, now you have somebody who was sort of a Catholic, sort of a, at least culturally there. Now he's just moving further and further away from that teaching.
Well,
I think that's a perfect example of what's going on across the board.
So, think of it this way. This is one of the ways I'm kind of thinking through the whole thing. It's like, how do you bless this? And be consistent. It's like, okay, Holy Father, I know it's the official dogma of the Catholic Church that we shouldn't have slaves, but I was hoping that you would bless my slave relationship, the slaves that I own anyway. I mean, how can you take a sin and still say it's okay to bless it, but we stand against it? This is
when this Fiducia and when the prayers of love and faith in the Anglican Church was signed off on, I think just a week or two before.
Yeah,
I saw one of Ian Paul's articles on it. There was people were just like, how are you going to do this with any other kind of sin?
Exactly. That's
how are you going to do this if a guy walks up with two wives, or a guy who walks up and he's married to his daughter? Like, what are you going to do then? So, I mean, this is a very, talk about being in a pastoral dilemma, especially, let's say you're a conservative priest or Anglican minister and you want to do that, right? Well, you're going to be accused by those who are boldly coming forward, and they'll probably have cameramen behind them, or at least some phones taking the video of you not blessing them, right?
Yeah.
So they can go after you. Or, of course, if you are a liberal and you don't believe that there's any need for transformation, then this just becomes a cause celeb for you.
Right.
And, you're just, so, I mean, it's an incredibly, I mean, it's just, there really is this sense that where are people going to go to see a real church of Christ on earth that is calling people to repent and be saved, saved. And I mean, we go to churches like that, so they're there. They do exist. But one does feel like it's becoming less and less.
Yeah. And it becomes pedagogical too. See, this is the problem. Is as you had mentioned, people look to the Pope, they look to the Anglican community, they say, well, if they say it's okay, then it must be okay. They don't crack open the theology books. They don't look at the history of the dogma. Nobody does that. And as that groundswell grows, again, that pressure we talked about at the beginning becomes more and more acute. And those who have the agenda will swing it wildly and say, well, even the Anglicans and even the Pope will do this, so you must be an outlier. And it biases the neutral Christian who's just not thought a lot through it. But
yeah, when the more institutional churches start to cave at the institutional level, right? I mean, it really does make the rest of us low church evangelicals look like, and that's fine because we expect that. We maybe even would hope for that. We'll look like the weirdos in the group, and we're fine with that. We'll be the haters, we'll be the weirdos, we'll be the ones to be thrown into the lion's den, whatever that might look like these days. One thing I do want to mention, though, and Boersma brings this up in the article as well, and under the subtitle Pastoral Cruelty. And I think this is something we have to mention because we know people who are in this position. Those men and women who are same-sex attracted, but are truly fighting the good fight of faith, who've embraced the burden that they have to bear. What are these churches telling them? It's kind of like, wasn't really that important that you've been fighting the last 30 or 40 years of your life, to be pure in your sexual habits and behavior. It's kind of like, I'm talking about throwing people under the bus.
Yeah.
And I still struggle to think what kind of support is out there. I mean, this is where the people like Rosaria Butterfield, I think, are doing a great service in being the one who's, people who've come out of there, Christopher Yuan, and they know because they've been there. Right. So like, I don't like listening to people who've never struggled with the sin themselves because I don't think they get it. But when you listen to like Rosaria Butterfield, maybe a Becket Cook, I don't know much about him, but I know he did come out of it. I mean, they know what it was like to be transformed from that particular kind of sin.
Right.
And I would say those are the voices you want to listen to, not the person who's the Preston Sprinkles or whatever was like, never had to even struggle with it. And there is that dynamic. I became very aware of it at my former place of education. The people who, by and large, they've lived pretty decent moral lives. They've been good Christians. They haven't really gone down that road. They tended to not really get how serious the sins actually are if you perform them. if you actually do them, then you know what they're like. You got the what's it like to be a sinner perspective, and you realize that what truly is needed is the transformation. The transformation is not something that we can poo-poo or water down, right? So anyways, so that was another thing that Boersma pointed out. I think it was really important because, we have friends who are holding fast and feel like they don't get much support at all when things like this come out. Anyways, I'll give you guys the last word, though. We'll wrap it up here. But, again, this idea of segregating or trying to strip away doctrine from pastoral care counseling seems to be a pandemic in the church.
Well, and it's only starting here. That's my other really big concern is what if it spreads past just our sexual mores, because our sexual mores tie into our identity as image bearers, and that can tie into, and of course you're seeing in the secular world, there's an idea of those that are haters, those that are quote unquote bigots, they don't necessarily deserve to be treated as equals. They don't necessarily deserve the honor and the respect that would be tacit for all human beings. And we've seen this play out. Anytime you put a series of individuals, a group together, and start castigating it and then start dehumanizing them, saying they're not quite as human or not worthy of the human protections of others, then it eventually does lead to domination, oppression, and real world oppression, things like, taking away of stripping all rights and physical abuse and things of that nature. That's the way human psyches are wired. That's the way human sin pushes us. And so once we start pulling away at those strings, I think it sets us up to see true monsters in our midst. I mean, if they can turn around, the secular world can turn around and justify the Hamas October 7th debacle, then you can justify anything.
Yeah. Logan, any final words?
Yeah, I mean, I think to take it kind of in a full circle, I think the problem with doctrines as they are being pitched today is that they're separated from consequences, and I think the answer would be to reintroduce consequences. I think the Protestant section of Christianity is probably more equipped to do this because we already have sort of the intellectual apparatus that clergy can stand before a priest and call him out almost like, unhindered by institutional, precedent. Like that's just kind of the thing we've done.
Hierarchy.
Yeah, we've just done this for hundreds of years. We can continue doing it because ultimately, like it's like we've somehow gotten to the point where it's about what we've separated, what we hoped for from what we did. When pastors support someone and then there's consequence, like, well, I did hope for the best. You're like, yeah, but here's what it resulted in. And I had a perfect conversation with someone about this. They were like coming at me pretty hard and were like, if you don't support trans surgery, the blood of their suicides on your hands. And I said, okay, how about this? I will accept that consequence if and only if they get the surgery and commit suicide, you get to take the blood on your hands. And they said no. And I said, that is the exact problem that we're at, is all the consequences are flowing one way and they're not flowing both ways. When a pastor says, oh, it's okay for you to like live with your, girlfriend, and then they get pregnant and then they have all these, problems, and then abortion comes, like, is the pastor being drug out into the streets? No, but probably should.
That's a good point. I think that's a valid point. And I would hope that people would think about that. All right. Well, gentlemen, been a good roundtable. Not a pleasant one, but I think a valuable one. So until next time, we'll see you then. God bless.
All right. See you then.
That's it.